the 13th apostle, the apostle of the Gentiles, the apostle of charity, tireless traveler of Jesus, the greatest missionary the church has ever known. There is no other man who has had such an extraordinary influence on the history and development of Christianity as the Apostle Paul. St. John Chrysostom, a father of the church and a great admirer of Paul, once said, "Paul was more honored than kings or rich men, though he spent his life in hunger and thirst." Blessed James Alberione, founder of the Pauline family, called Paul an ardent lover of Jesus Christ and attributed to him the miraculous cure he received shortly after he had founded the Society of St. Paul and the Daughters of St. Paul. He often stated to his young followers, "You are to consider Paul as your founder and your father, and the model of your life, spirituality, and mission." Key events in Paul's life. The crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ occurred in the spring of 32 AD. In about 37 AD, Jesus Christ speaks to Paul on the road to Damascus. Paul is led blind into Damascus. Paul then goes to Arabia and returns to Damascus, where he spends 3 years. Paul departed from Damascus at night, being let down from the city wall in a basket. Barnabas gets Paul, and they stay in Antioch for 1 year. This must be between 41 AD and 44 AD. Believers are first called Christians at Antioch. The first journey begins when Paul, Barnabas, and Mark set off from Antioch. This journey started after 44 AD and ended before the year 50. In about 50 AD, Paul and Barnabas go to the council in Jerusalem. The second journey begins possibly in the spring of 51. Paul takes Silas through Syria and Cilicia, now southeastern Turkey. Paul then makes his first visit to Corinth, where he stays 1.5 years. This may have been from the spring of 52 to the fall of 53. Here, Paul met Aquila and Priscilla, who had just come from Rome, from which Claudius Caesar had banished all the Jews. The third journey begins with Galatia in the central region of Turkey, possibly in the spring of 54, and continues to Phrygia. The third journey ends at Jerusalem in 58. Paul is beaten by the Jews, preaches to them, and is brought before the Sanhedrin. Jesus Christ tells Paul that he will go to bear him witness in Rome. Many Jews vow to kill Paul. In 58 AD, Paul is taken to Governor Felix, who reigned from the year 53 to 60 in Caesarea. In 60 AD, Governor Porcius Festus' reign begins, and Paul appeals to Caesar. Some days pass, then Herod Agrippa II hears Paul. The voyage to Rome begins. Paul, still a prisoner, sails to Sidon with Luke and Aristarchus on the way to Italy. They sail to Myra, now southern Turkey, and on to Lycia, a large island of Crete, 50 miles southeast of Greece, where much time was spent. In the fall of 60, they reached Melita, a small island south of Sicily. Paul was bitten by a poisonous snake, but lived. Paul healed the father of Publius and others. Paul, still a captive, spends the winter of 60 to 61 AD on the island with his captors. In the spring, they sailed on to Syracuse, an island of Sicily, then to Rhegium on the southern tip of Italy, then to Puteoli on the western coast of Italy. The voyage to Rome ends. Paul spends 2 years in his own hired house as a prisoner in Rome from 61 to 63. During this time, he wrote the letters to the Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. In about 62, Paul wrote Ephesians before Timothy came to him while in prison in Rome. Also in about 62 AD, Paul wrote Philippians from prison in Rome with Timothy. Paul wrote Colossians from prison in Rome in about 62 with Timothy and a fellow prisoner Aristarchus. Paul, with Timothy, wrote Philemon from prison in 63 AD. We know that Paul probably made further journeys after he was released from the prison in Rome in 63 AD. Paul was in prison again, ready to die, possibly around the year 66. Paul was probably martyred sometime around the year 67. So who is Paul? According to St. Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, Paul was a Jew born at Tarsus in the Roman province of Cilicia around 10 AD. He grew up in a Jewish family, was educated in schools which surpassed those of Athens and Alexandria, in a town where philosophers settled and taught, and which received such famous Roman visitors as Cicero, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra. Luke states in the Acts of the Apostles that Paul studied in Jerusalem under Gamaliel, a gentle Pharisee who knew about Jesus and who counseled the Jewish leaders to leave the followers of Jesus alone. Paul would have been growing up and studying in Jerusalem during Jesus' lifetime, if this biographical statement of Luke is correct. However, Paul never mentions any encounter or personal acquaintance with Jesus. Paul himself never states that he studied in Jerusalem under the teacher Gamaliel. Paul's letters instead reveal that he could read and write Greek well, had a Greek education, and usually quoted the Old Testament in Greek. By the time of his conversion, the moment when he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, Paul was a recognized teacher with the right to make legal decisions. Paul was what you could call a, quote, militant right-winger, unquote, who felt the use of violence justified in preserving the identity of the Jewish people. Paul had devoted his life's energies exclusively to preserving his religious traditions against an occupying power, Rome. He was determined through his zealous efforts to hasten the coming of the triumphant arrival of the kingdom of God. On the road to Damascus, however, that was all to change. Paul was en route to the city of Damascus to round up the Jews there who followed the way. These Jews who followed Jesus were a threat to the integrity and security of the Jewish community. As he rode along, however, something incredible happened. In the words of the Acts of the Apostles, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound but did not see anyone. Paul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. What happens when a person as determined and sure of himself as Paul is confronted by God, who in effect says, "You are barking up the wrong tree"? Here was Jesus appearing to him on the road to Damascus, which meant that he had indeed risen from the dead. God had vindicated Jesus. Paul realized he had been wrong.